So one of these handouts is just the bibliography for today. The other we're going to do something with in a minute. But I guess first I just kind of want to remind everybody of what the assignment is for next time. It's going to read about the next 70 pages or so of the picture Dorian Gray. And so we'll come back and talk about that on Tuesday. Are either of you familiar at all with this novel? Have either of you read this or read Wilde before?
I feel like I've read Wilde before. I definitely know the name, and I feel
Okay.
like I've read stuff, but I don't remember.
Okay.
But
Maybe The Importance of Being Earnest?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
That's
Yeah.
That
I've
rings
been
a
a
bell.
while ago.
Yeah. Yeah, you may have read that in high school, or maybe if you took Brit Lit 2 with somebody other than me, because I just don't teach that one Brit Lit 2. But yeah, okay, so anything that you remember about Wilde or about Wilde's work or his style from whenever you read The Importance of Being Earnest?
It's very satirical
Okay.
on like the aristocracy or the higher class.
Okay, yeah, there's the kind of mocking attitude frequently towards aristocracy, yeah. Good, anything else that you recall?
No. It was like 3 years ago. I'm gonna be honest, I don't think I enjoyed The Importance of Being Earnest. I didn't enjoy a lot of things in that class. So.
Well, arguably comedy doesn't age as well as tragedy does. Like comedy tends to be a little bit more topical. So when you get further away from the period in which it was written, it's often hard to see what the joke was. Okay, so you remember kind of mocking attitudes towards aristocracy. Right now, I'm going to put 2 words up on the board here, and just tell me if they ring any bells for you. Totally fine if they don't. I'm just trying to gauge how much you already know. So, aestheticism and decadence.
Well, I can definitely tell through this that there's a lot of aestheticism in it.
Okay. How so? Like, what about this seems aestheticist or decadent to you?
I don't know. Maybe it's just like the language and just kind of like the scenery he like poses. It just everything just
Okay.
kind of seems like they're in this like green like. I feel like whenever he's like painting, so he's in like this like open room and it's like green and like I don't know. That's the vision that comes to my head.
Yeah, I mean, like, we start out in Basil Hallward's studio, right? And like essentially his home seems that we only really see 2 parts of his home, right? We see the artist's studio, and we see the garden. And I would argue that these spaces actually do have a lot to do with each other, right? In that they're both spaces in some sense of artificial cultivation. Right? Do flowers just grow naturally in a garden?
No.
No, yeah, you have to take care of them. Right? You have to plant them, you have to water them, and you select which flowers are going to grow in your garden, right? Because anything that's growing in your garden that you didn't choose is a weed. So the garden is a space of creation, of artistic creation, just as the artist's studio is, right? So yeah, these are the kinds of spaces that we're seeing. We also see Dorian in a theater, right? So we have all of these art spaces described for us in the novel, right? So is there anything else that seems particularly kind of aestheticist or decadent about this? What about Lord Henry's conversation?
Which one? When he talks to Dorian at first?
Yeah, well, just generally, the kind of like, just the way he talks in general.
Yeah, the language he uses is, he's like really philosophical. Like
Yeah.
he's really going deeper into things and kind of looking at this like outlook on life.
Yeah, he speaks almost entirely in art theory, right?
I feel like also, for you like, when you think of this time period, like late 1800s, this is like the stuff that comes to mind, like the fancy like guys and like their weird clothing and like the paintings and the theater. Like,
Yeah.
so it feels like very like cliche almost.
Okay, so yeah, so I think, okay, so you do know at least something of the general tone of the late Victorian period. Okay, yeah, this is in a lot of ways pretty typical of it, but I think we're also seeing in the development of the decadent movement and Wilde's place in it, a move towards what is going to be called modernism, and a kind of move, like, it's kind of like, decadence is really about endings, right? It's about this sense that everything is coming to an end, and what you're trying to do is just squeeze the last couple of drops of fruit juice out of a dying fruit, right?
Well, we definitely see that in like the portrait of Dorian Gray, and I felt like after Lord Henry's comment about like this is the last time you're going to be this young, I feel like Dorian really opens his eyes, and that kind of plays along in that whole decadence thing about, you know, you're only growing older.
Yeah, I mean, like, decadence comes from the same Latin root as the word decay, right? And so there is often a kind of sense of the morbid around decadent art, right? It is an art about the inevitability of death, and it is about change and about just kind of like again, like kind of getting those last couple little bits of sweetness, right? Because when does a fruit taste the sweetest? When does a flower smell the sweetest?
Right at the end.
Yeah, right before it dies, right? So it's like, I have, some bananas sitting on my kitchen counter at home, right? They're at the point where, the skins are all kind of covered with brown spots now, right? So they're really soft, really ripe, really sweet right now. But in a day or two, they're going to go bad, right? They're going to be rotting, and they're going to be inedible. So when you are tasting the sweetness of a ripe fruit, what you are tasting is that fruit's death, right? As the sugars break down. And that's really what decadent art is concerned with, a lot of what it's about, is tracing and savoring the last fruits of that breakdown. So I'm going to show you a clip from a popular opera of the period. The opera is called Patience. It's written by W.S. Gilbert and Arthur Sullivan. And it's first performed in 1881. So about 10 years before the picture of Dorian Gray is published. So what I'd like you to do, and so what you're going to see here is one of the main antagonist of the opera, who's a famous poet by the name of Reginald Bunthorne. And this scene is Bunthorne's confession of his true nature, right? So that's the handout that I've given you is the lyrics to the song that he sings here. So what I want you to do is pay attention to the words, or pay attention to the lyrics. But I also want you to observe things about the way Bunthorne is presented here. What does he look like? What do you notice about his hair, about his clothes, about his mannerisms? And is this working yet? Good, looks like it.
Am I alone and unobserved? I am. Then let me go. I'm an aesthetic shell. hands and haggard cheeks do not delight me. I do not care for dirty greens by any means. I do not long for all one sees that's Japanese. I am not fond of hovering platitudes and stained-glass attitudes. In short, my medievalism's affectation, born of a morbid love of admiration. If you're anxious for to shine in the high aesthetic line as a man of culture rare, you must get up all the germs of the transcendental terms and drop them everywhere. You must lie upon the daisies and discourse in novel phrases of your complicated state of mind. The meaning doesn't matter if it's only idle chatter of a transcendental kind. And everyone will say, as you walk your mystic way, if this young man expresses himself in terms too deep for me, why, what a singularly deep young man this deep young man must be. Be eloquent in praise of the very dull old days which have long since passed away, and convince him, if you can, that the reign of Queen Anne was culture's palmiest day. And of course you will poo-poo whatever's fresh and new and declare it's crude and mean. For art stops short in the cultivated court of the Empress Josephine. And everyone will say, as you walk your mystic way, if that's not good enough for him, which is good enough for me, why, what a very cultivated kind of youth this kind of youth must be. The sentimental passion of a vegetable fashion must excite your lang and spleen. An attachment a la Plato for a bashful young potato or a French bean. Though the Philistines may jostle, you will reign as an apostle in a high aesthetic band. If you walk down Piccadilly with a poppy or a lily in your medieval hand. And everyone will say, as you walk your flowery way, if he's content with a vegetable lawn, which would certainly not suit me, why, what a most particularly pure young man this pure young man must be.
Okay, so let's take a minute and talk about this. So what did you notice about this character, Bunthorne, and the way he's depicted here?
He was joking, right? This was like, okay, I didn't want to be like, was this supposed to be funny? Okay, and I was like, I'm pretty sure it is.
Yeah, this is a comedy, right?
Okay.
And it's supposed to be a satire on the aesthetic movement, right? Now again, because we're removed in time from this movement, right, it's maybe not quite so funny to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was definitely the 100% playing on the whole aesthetic chart. Like, you can just tell, like, the background, like, the whole scene, it looks like kind of like a Shakespeare type thing. And his outfit, and just kind of gives off that whole thing.
Yeah, what about his outfit? What is he dressed like?
Like something.
Something people would wear back then, like a
Like if you look at pictures of the way like an ordinary gentleman dressed in the 1880s and the 1890s, right? You get these kind of like long dark frock coats and top hats, right? You know, they might wear evening dress, which is something like a tuxedo, right? When they're out and about. Is he dressed like an adult?
No, he's just like a kid.
Yeah, he looks more like an overgrown child, right? With the long hair, because like children of both sexes tended to have long hair in the 19th century, right? And the big frilly cravat, right? Yeah, his outfit is more like a child's pinafore than a grown
Like
man's.
the stockings and everything.
Yeah, he's got the stockings, yeah. So he's kind of like a big kid. What else do we notice about, so we talked a little bit about his clothes, his appearance. What about his mannerisms?
It's very like dramatized, like he's like,
Like him throwing himself like the room.
Yeah, everything's really emphatic and kind of histrionic, right? Every gesture is theatrical. And this is a play, so of course, to some extent, but it's exaggerated, right? Yeah, his gestures are exaggerated and also, very affected, very artificial. Everything's a pose. What else do you notice? What do you notice about the lyrics that he's singing? What is he essentially admitting to here?
like
I mean, I took it as he was basically saying like, I'm pretending to be this like aesthetic dude, but in reality, I'm literally just like an overgrown little kid.
Yeah. Essentially, what he's saying is that I'm a big phony, right? I'm an aesthetic sham. All of this is just a pose. All of this is just pretend. Right? That he is literally, a poser. And I think one way in which this is important, is like every generation has its kind of hipster youth culture, right? So, you have hippies in the 60s, you have punks in the late 70s, you have goths at various points in the 80s, right? And the decadents are kind of the 1890s equivalent of that, right? Which means you'll always have some people who are in it for whatever the art is, right? And some people who are in it primarily for the fashion or for attention. And what does Bunthorne argue in this first verse paragraph here near the end is his primary motivation. Why does he put on that this is what he's like?
He likes the attention.
Yeah, he wants attention, right? My medievalism's affectation, born of a morbid love of admiration, right? He just wants people to pay attention to him and to think he's special. And there's also in the verses here a kind of rundown of various decadent concerns and obsessions, right? We have flowers. Right? We have a kind of worship of the past. And a suggestion that the past is somehow better than the present, right? That we're at the end of times now. And also, which I think is really pretty deeply relevant to the picture of Dorian Gray, references to the concept of platonic love in the final stanzas, right? So we'll go into a little bit more detail about what that means and why it's relevant shortly. But first I do want to talk a little bit about kind of where all this is coming from, right? And what it's reacting to. Okay, so for much of the Victorian period, right, the dominant political and cultural philosophy is what we now call utilitarian. Well, actually, they called it that then too. It's called utilitarianism. Is anybody familiar with utilitarianism? Has anybody ever heard of this before?
Is that, I think I'm thinking of, what is it when there's like one leader?
You're thinking of authoritarianism.
I'm thinking of that.
Uh-huh. So utilitarianism, well, let's try to break down the word then, right? What word do we see contained within utilitarian?
Utility.
Utility, right? And what does utility mean?
Something that'll like help you, like it's a utility.
Yeah.
Useful thing.
Yeah, utility means like use or useful, right? So utilitarianism is essentially kind of philosophy of usefulness. But early utilitarian thinkers, like Jeremy Bentham, at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th centuries, defined utility in very specific ways, right? So for Bentham, what utility meant was whatever increases pleasure or reduces pain for the greatest number of people. Right? So anything that makes a large number of people happy, or at least makes them feel less bad, is a good thing, right? Things that only make some people happy, or that don't reduce pain, or that increase pain, right? Those would be the things that would be, kind of worst, right? Are bad ideas, right? Things that should not be implemented. Now, one of the problems with Bentham's philosophy, as artists and art theorists saw it, is that it led to a kind of attitude towards art, which suggested that all art needed to be, like, one, suitable for mass consumption, and two, socially useful in some way, right? So a lot of Victorian literature and Victorian art is what we call didactic. Does anybody know what didactic means?
Part of it.
Yeah, I've seen the word. I don't-
Okay. So something that's didactic is meant to teach a lesson. Right? Or is attached to some broader social purpose. Right? There's some bigger argument involved here. And aestheticism, which comes before decadence, is largely an attempt to free art from the need to have any sort of morally improving or social purpose, right? So the first aestheticist writers, as I said, are French, and they're working in the 1850s. So a good bit earlier than Wilde. Certainly early enough that they can be influences here, right? So the major figures here are the poet Charles Baudelaire and the novelist Théophile Gautier. So Baudelaire wrote an influential book of poetry in 1857 called Fleur de Mal. Or Flowers of Evil. And what the title means, are any of you familiar with Baudelaire? Anybody, like, did anybody take World Lit and do Baudelaire and World Lit maybe?
Yes, I think, yes.
Okay, so did you talk at all about Flowers of Evil and what that means?
I remember saying the name. I'm pretty sure we talked about it.
Okay. So a lot of what Baudelaire's work is about is growing something beautiful out of something ugly, right? Taking unpromising or disgusting materials and using it to make something beautiful. So for example, one of the poems in Fleur de Mal is called Correspondences. And of course, now I can't remember where the hell in this stupid book it is. Because like an idiot, I didn't mark the page. So Correspondences is a sonnet, right? And the second half of the sonnet in English reads thusly. Perfumes there are as sweet as the oboe's sound. Green as the prairies, fresh as a child's caress. And there are others, rich, corrupt, profound, and of an infinite pervasiveness, like myrrh, or musk, or amber, that excite the ecstasies of sense, the soul's delight. Now the key here is these three materials he mentioned in the last three lines here. Myrrh, and musk, and ambergris. Do y'all know what myrrh is?
Like the oil, right?
Yeah, it's made out of tree sap, right? It's made out of this kind of like nasty, sticky tree sap. What about musk? So musk is sweat from the ass glands of a deer.
Nice.
Are we noticing a pattern here? Tree sap, deer ass sweat, and ambergris. Does anybody know what ambergris is? It's whale puke.
Oh, of course.
But the basic point here, right, is that on their own, these things are disgusting, right? When these things are in nature, like you wouldn't want to go near them. You don't want to touch them. But through human creativity and ingenuity, these all become the base for beautiful perfumes, right? So Baudelaire's basic thesis throughout much of his work is that nature is ugly. Nature is gross. Nature is disgusting. And if you want to make nature beautiful, then you have to do something to it, right? The artificial, the man-made, is always better than the natural. Gautier is best known for writing a novel. When the hell did he write? It's actually quite a bit earlier, in 1835, called Mademoiselle Maupin. You don't need to remember the name of the novel. Nobody ever reads it anymore. The important part of the novel really is the preface, in which he kind of outlines his aesthetic theory. Right? And one of the things that Gautier says that is proven particularly influential is that the most useful object in your house is your toilet. But you'd be an idiot if you admired it, right? Things that are useful and functional are ugly. The only reason to have a piece of art in your house is because you admire it, because it's beautiful. So, the motto of the French aesthetics becomes l'art pour l'art, which I know my French pronunciation here is terrible, but this translates in English to something like art for art's sake, or art for its own sake. And this gets picked up in England in the 1870s by a shy and retiring Oxford don by the name of Walter Pater. who was one of Wilde's teachers when Wilde was a student at Oxford. Right, he attended some of Pater's lectures. And Pater in 1873 publishes a book of art criticism that he calls Studies in the History of the Renaissance. Now, the basic thesis of the book is that it's pointless to study a period in art history or in cultural history in isolation, because we can always see the seeds of any new period that's coming up in the earlier period, plus whatever's going to come after emerging from it, right? Not only that, but things that are in the period you're studying are also going to continue into the next period. But that's not really the important part for our purposes here today, right? So, studies in the history of the Renaissance includes a conclusion that after the first edition is published, is actually suppressed by the publisher. It's removed because people complain about the possible implications of it. So to give you some sense of why people were incensed by this, I'm just going to read a little bit from it. So it starts with a quote in Greek from the philosopher Heraclitus. And the quote says, "All things are in motion, and nothing is at rest." So Heraclitus is kind of like the ancient Greek philosopher of flux, right, of change. He's the guy who says that you can never put your foot in the same river twice, because that river is constantly in motion, right? Every time you put your foot in that river, it's something new, it's something different, right? The only constant in the universe is change. And I think we were talking a little bit about some of Lord Henry's conversation with Dorian, right? And a lot of the things he says tend along these sorts of lines, right? So let's actually go to the picture of Dorian Gray. And let's pick, if we can find, what he says to Dorian. In the garden. Okay, when he's talking about the new hedonism on page 22. So this is a long paragraph, right? But I think it's probably worth sitting here and kind of teasing out the implications of the whole thing. Can I get one of you to start reading from "No, You Don't Feel It Now"? You have a different edition, don't you?
Yeah, I don't know. I ordered it at the bookstore, but I guess it's different.
Oh, jeez.
I don't know.
Okay, so it's the paragraph.
No, you don't feel it now?
So it's no, you don't feel it.
Okay, I have it.
Okay, got it. Okay. So can one of you please just start reading for us? Okay.
No, you don't feel it now. Someday when you are old and wrinkled and ugly, when thought has seared your forehead with its lines, and passion branded your lips with its hideous fires, you will feel it terribly. Now wherever you go, you charm the world. Will it always be so? You have a wonderfully beautiful face, and Mr. Gray, don't frown, you have. And beauty is a form of genius, is higher indeed than genius, as it needs no explanation. It is of the great facts of the world, like sunlight or springtime, or the reflection in dark waters of that silver shell we call the moon. It cannot be questioned. It has its divine right of sovereignty. It makes princes of those who have it. You smile? Ah, when you have lost it, you won't smile. People say sometimes that beauty is only superficial. That may be so, but at least it is not so superficial as thought is. To me, beauty is the wonder of wonders. It is only shallow people who do not judge by appearances. The true mystery of the world is the visible, not the invisible. Yes, Mr. Wright, the gods have been good to you. But what the gods give, they quickly take away. You have only a few years in which to live really, perfectly, and fully. When your youth goes, your beauty will go with it, and then you will suddenly discover that there are no triumphs left for you, or have to content yourself with those mean triumphs that the memory of your past will make more bitter than defeats. Every month has its wanes, brings you near to something dreadful. Time is jealous of you, and wars against your lilies and your roses. You will become sallow and hollow-cheeked and dull-eyed. You will suffer horribly. Ah, realize your youth while you have it. Don't squander the gold of your days, listening to the tedious, trying to improve the hopeless failure, or giving away your life to the ignorant, the common, and the vulgar. Want me to keep going?
Yep, keep going.
These are the sickly
You're just kind of getting to the meat of it here.
Yeah. These are the sickly aims, the false ideals of our age. Live the wonderful life that is in you. Let nothing be lost upon you. Be always searching for new sensations. Be afraid of nothing. A new hedonism, that is what our century wants. You might be its visible symbol. With your personality, there is nothing you cannot do. The world belongs to you for a season. The moment I met you, I saw that you were quite unconscious of what you really are, of what you really might be. There was so much in you that charmed me that I felt I must tell you something about yourself. I thought how tragic it would be if you were wasted. For there is such a little time that your youth will last, such little time. The common hill flowers wither, but they blossom again. The laburnum will be as yellow next June as it is now. In a month, there will be purple stars on the clematis, and year after year, the green night of its leaves will hold its purple stars. But we never get back to our youth. The pulse of joy that beats in us at 20 becomes sluggish. Our limbs fail, our senses rot. We degenerate into hideous puppets, haunted by the memory of the passions of which we were too much afraid, and the exquisite temptations that we had not the courage to yield to. Youth, youth. There is absolutely nothing in the world but youth.
Thank you.
Hmm?
So speaking from the perspective of one of these degenerate, hideous puppets whose youth has passed by, right? A lot of this is taken directly from Walter Pater's conclusion, right? We'll kind of see what bits in a moment here, right? But what's the basic gist here of Lord Henry's arguments?
Basically that we're growing old and that
Yeah.
we only get to be young once, and you might as well live while you can, and you're just going to become a hideous puppet.
He's basically saying carpe diem, but he took like 10 pages to do it.
Yeah.
Basically. Basically.
Yeah, it is a carpe diem kind of argument, right? But essentially what he is arguing for here is the primacy of beauty, right? That the thing that's important in life is beauty, and to appreciate beauty while we still have it, because what happens to beauty? It inevitably decays and fades, right? Now, what is interesting about a person compared to a picture, generally? What's the usual relationship between a person and a portrait of that person in relation to time?
The portrait is younger than the actual person.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, the portrait will always be younger than the person, right? The image in the portrait will always be younger than the person is. You know, from the moment it's finished. is, yeah, that image in the portrait doesn't age, doesn't change. It's permanent. It's locked in, right? This is, the same thing with a photograph, right? You take, like, say, your senior picture from high school, right? It's like, okay, this is me at 18, right? Now, then, at 43, it's still you, right? But it's not the same you. Because those processes of change have inevitably set in, right? So what Pater is arguing about in his conclusion is, first, our tendency to form habits that deaden us to aesthetic impressions, right? So the example he uses is something like, your friend walking up to you on a summer day and splashing you with a little bit of cold water, right? How does that feel?
Good, because it's hot outside.
Yeah, you get like this kind of little thrill from it, right? You feel all tingly for a minute, and it's pleasant, right? And then what happens if they do it again?
Becomes annoying.
Yeah. Well, and more importantly, right, you don't get that tingly feeling again, right? Because your body is adjusted to it. So that sensation that you had then can't be recaptured. So the part of Pater's argument that got the moralists and Philistines in a rut had to do with this kind of notion that we had to find some way to make our subjective impressions somehow last, right? So he says, to burn always with this hard gem-like flame, to maintain this ecstasy is success in life. In a sense, it might even be said that our failure is to form habits. For after all, habit is relative to a stereotyped world, and meantime it is only the roughness of the eye that makes any two persons, things, situations seem alike. While all melts under our feet, we may well grasp at any exquisite passion, or any contribution to knowledge that seems by a lifted horizon to set the spirit free for a moment, or any stirring of the senses, strange dyes, strange colors, and curious odors, or work of the artist's hands, or the face of one's friend. So, what he says, we need to find some way to maintain this feeling that we get from that first aesthetic impression, right? And one way we do that is by kind of constantly seeking out the new. Constantly finding new sources of beauty. Unfamiliar sources of beauty. Unfamiliar sources of enjoyment. And this is kind of directly influencing Lord Henry's new hedonism philosophy, right? That what you need to do is go out and grab all the beauty that you can, because beauty inevitably fades. Now, Pater was desperately shy, reclusive, fairly religious, a deeply closeted homosexual, and was horrified at the idea that anyone might have taken his conclusion as, an excuse to go run riot. So he was completely okay with the removal of it from his book. Yeah, go ahead.
Honestly, like whenever we first were reading this book, like whenever I first started reading it, I thought this was kind of like a homosexual type situation going on.
Yeah, and I think that
it kind of just seems like it. It seems like they all kind of like each other, and I was like, I don't know what's going on, but
yeah, no, you're not wrong. I mean, there is, I would say there is a gay subtext in it, but it's not really subtext, right?
Right.
Now, a lot of what's going on here, actually, though, is what we referred to a moment ago, the notion of platonic love, which is deeply in the air in late Victorian Britain among these aesthetic and decadent circles, right? So, on the one hand, the decadents in particular are kind of fixated on sex. But they tend to be fixated on non-reproductive forms of sex. Like, for example, like Baudelaire was fascinated by lesbians. And so when they write about sex, they tend to write about either homosexual activity or other forms of sex that would not result in conception, right? Now, if you look at this from the logic of decadence, right? These are people who basically think that the world is running itself down, right?
I guess they wouldn't want to reproduce because then they're being more into like a
Yeah, exactly. It's like, yeah, why make more people in a world that's ending, right? Let's just enjoy ourselves while we still have what's here, right? So that's the basic philosophy there, right? But it becomes joined among some of the decadents, particularly those who have the deeper aesthetic influence, with this notion of Platonic love that dates back to ancient Greece and to Plato's book, or Plato's dialogue, the Symposium, which is from around roughly 380 BCE. With the ancient Greek dates are always kind of approximate. So Plato's argument in the Symposium, right, is there are basically two kinds of love. There is carnal love, right, love of the body, which only the lower sorts of people, which is all the lower sorts of people are really capable of. So basically, commoners and women, in Plato's point of view, are only capable of this kind of carnal love, right?
I think you read this one in World. It wasn't the other one like about wisdom and love?
Yeah, exactly. Like so enlightened aristocratic men, according to Plato's argument, are able to kind of transform love of the body into kind of love of truth. What originates as love of beauty can be transmuted into love of truth and knowledge, right? A kind of spiritual love. And that's it's exactly the kind of thing that Gilbert and Sullivan are mocking in Am I Alone and Unobserved? Right, the affection of Plato for a bashful young potato, right? This kind of sexless vegetable love, right? But this is something that a lot of the decadents hold up as an ideal, right? In part because it's giving a kind of classical philosophical veneer to sexual passions that many of them are feeling anyway, right? But this is kind of like in particular, what Basil Hallward's attraction to Dorian is. Right? Like Dorian, for Basil, is more kind of like an ideal. It's hard, it's hard to picture Basil actually trying to seduce Dorian, right?
Right. I thought from it that Basil was just like really just like encapsulated by like Dorian's beauty, and I was like, maybe he had like some kind of like crush on him, but like this is like really just infatuated with this, and then Lord Harry comes in and he's like, oh, I like you. And then Dorian's like, Basil's annoying.
Uh-huh.
And I'm like, okay. and then Basil's just like, sit still. And
Yeah.
I'm like, what's going on?
And then Dorian goes and gets engaged to an actress, right?
Yeah.
So it's,
And then I was like, what? I was like, Sybil.
Yeah.
I think, like, to me, I could definitely see where, like, Basil would have, like, a crush on Dorian. But I think it was more of, like, the artist or, like, their muse sort of situation.
Yeah.
It reminds me of, like, something very specific, but it is not, like, coming to my brain at all. So if I remember it, I'll make sure to write it down. But,
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think it's probably worth noting here, right, that this novel was actually published in two versions. So the first publication of it was in 1890 in a popular American literary magazine called Lippincott's. Wilde was actually famous in America before he was famous in Britain. And the 1890 serialized publication didn't include the preface, which we haven't talked about yet, but probably should before we close today, and was also much more overtly queer. So when, in 1891, the London publishers Ward Lock and Company issued the book in both a normal standard edition and also in a kind of illustrated gift book edition. Wilde actually adds a good bit of text, including the preface, and much of the Sybil Vane material. Although there is the engagement to Sybil Vane in the original 1890 edition. But his dealings with her are much more brief, and there's nothing about her family. But yeah, a lot of what is done to kind of revise the novel, and that's what we have here, is the 1891 edition, really kind of tones down any overt references to homosexuality. So, given that you both picked up on that this is still pretty gay, yeah, the 1890, it's way more over the top and obvious in the 1890 edition.
I think much more obvious.
Well, and remember that in the 1880s, I forget exactly what year, but Parliament passed a law that explicitly made illegal homosexual acts between men. So publishing anything like this in Britain in this period, there's kind of a delicate dance, right? You have to perfect. So Wilde couldn't be too overt about this, but the platonic love stuff kind of helps to soften it for some readers, right? But yeah, it's clear that despite the Sybil Vane thing, the important relationships here are almost entirely among these three male characters.
I feel like you see that a lot, like back then. I know, like in London in like the 18th century, I know there was like a lot of different plays, like Beggar's Opera. Like there were so many different like satirical things that you couldn't outright say because there were so many different laws and things like that.
Well, it's actually it's funny you bring that up too. There is a literary theorist, I think she just died a couple of years ago, Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick. She wrote a book called The Epistemology of the Closet. And one of the key concepts that she's associated with she calls the homosocial triangle. And she sees this in a lot of 18th and 19th century Anglo-American literature, where you'll have these two male characters whose interests really seem to be primarily in each other. But in order to make the thing not gay, the object of contention between them becomes a woman, right? So a woman is added to the narrative to reduce queer tension between male characters. Now,
that's not even like today.
oh yeah. It's funny. Like I was when I teach this in theory, I show a David Bowie video from the early 70s, just a concert video from one of the Ziggy Stardust tours, and you've got the two male figures on stage. You've got Bowie, kind of decked out in a white kimono and crazy red hair, and all kinds of makeup. And then his guitarist next to him, Mick Ronson, who is, he's dressed in black, and he's still wearing makeup, but he's like kind of much more butch and conventionally masculine, like wielding guitar as phallus. But then you see the kind of like mediating the relationship between them is this crowd of, 13 to 16-year-old girls in front of them who are just going nuts for this. Right? So, yeah, you see this all over popular culture. But yeah, the funny thing I think about the picture of Dorian Gray, though, is that like the women are all kind of completely incidental, right? If anything, they're just a distraction.
It is strange because I feel like Lord Henry, like he has his wife, right?
Yeah.
They're just like, oh, do my thing, you do your thing,
Yeah.
whatever. Yeah, they just like don't even care. Like, I'll see you, whatever.
Yeah, and their relationship is entirely based on lies, right? None of them ever has any idea what the other is doing. They're genuinely surprised to see each other when they run into one another at home.
Hello. Didn't know you were here.
Yeah, they live completely separate lives in completely different spheres, right? And I think it's also important, I think, to note why Dorian falls in love with Sybil. Right? What is Sybil?
An actress.
Yeah.
So I was thinking, like, because she's an actress and she plays these different roles, that
Mhm.
like her beauty kind of always seems new. Because
Yeah.
she would be like these different characters, so it's kind of just always like something new, which I think really encapsulates him after he like talks to Lord Henry and like takes his advice.
Yeah. He doesn't really know Sybil, right? He knows her as Juliet, he knows her as Imogen, he knows her as Rosalind, right? As all these Shakespeare heroines. So what captivates him is not the woman herself, but the masks that she wears. And I think, like, kind of getting back to the song from Patience, right? Where Bunthorne sings about being an aesthetic sham, right? A real thoroughgoing aesthete would say, well, yeah, everybody's a sham. Every attitude is basically a pose. Everybody has a set of masks that they take on and off every day, depending on who they're dealing with, right? All artists, and indeed all individuals, play a part. Everybody is on some level a poser. But this actually kind of goes right back to Wilde's preface. I think we'll finish up by talking a little bit about the preface here, right?
This is a little difficult.
Okay.
I had to read it quite a few
Yeah. This kind of did your head in a little bit?
times. Yes, I had my roommate look at it. I was like, can you read this and tell me what is going on?
Who's your roommate?
She's a nursing major.
Okay.
And I was like, can you read this? And she was like, I don't know what this is.
Okay, so if we look towards the bottom of the first page here, right? So from the point of view of form, the type of all arts is the art of the musician. From the point of view of feeling, the actor's craft is the type. So we'll get back to form in a second. But what's an actor's relationship to feeling?
I mean, they had to make it up.
Yeah.
They put on like a facade to like
Yeah.
feel something. It's not, they don't
Mhm.
truly feel it, but they
Yeah. It's making yourself feel something someone else is supposed to be feeling, right? So what an actor is doing is trying to build a kind of imaginative empathy with a character. Right, in order to try to fully inhabit that mask. Now then we say here, from the point of view of form, the type of all arts is the art of the musician. do we get what Wilde means by form here? So form is basically the structure that an artist gives to the materials that they're working with, right? So Basil Hallward, for example, in painting his picture of Dorian, gives form to canvas, a set of pigments, and an object that he is imitating on that canvas, right? So he applies his particular skills to make that into a painting. Now, when we talk about music, right, from the point of view of form, the type of all arts is the art of the musician. What do you think this means? If form is the structure that we apply to the content we're working with and the materials. How is music different from most other arts?
Has its own sound?
Okay, yeah, for one, it's based on sound primarily, right, rather than sight.
It also has like a bunch of different parts because like you have like the classical, like there isn't one instrument that's like in like one song. Like of course there's like the solos,
Sure.
but like in the song you're playing at either class, it's a whole orchestra. So it's not just like okay, one person can do it. It's you have to have a band to like play music.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I think the main point here, I think, I'm going to ask a question that I think will get us there, right? Can you actually tell a story or make a picture in music? Yeah, you can suggest moods and feelings, right? But unless you add lyrics, right, basically unless you add poetry, music is just music, right? So music is essentially pure form, right? It's just structure. It's just math, really. For example, if I know that, if I play notes that are 3 steps apart from each other on the fretboard of a guitar, I know that's going to create a kind of like dissonant, Black Sabbath-y kind of sound, right? It's just math, it's just counting, right? And that's kind of what he means here. Music is pure form. And what is the thing, what is the art that Dorian himself actually practices, at least? Maybe not professionally, but the thing that he actually does. Look at the bottom of page 10, where he's first being introduced to where Basil is telling the story of how Dorian was first introduced to him. Oh, something like, charming boy, poor dear mother and I, absolutely inseparable. Quite forget what he does, afraid he doesn't do anything. Oh yes, plays the piano. Or is it the violin, dear Mr. Gray? Yeah.
Or the violin.
Yeah, or the violin. Or, it doesn't do anything, really. And when he first appears in Basil's studio, right, when Henry and Basil come back from the garden and he's sitting there, he is leafing through a book of Robert Schumann's forest scenes. This is a book of music, like Schumann was a composer. So yeah, Dorian is a musician. So he is associated there kind of with pure form. In fact, I don't know, do either of you know anything? Do either of you play an instrument? Do you know anything about music theory?
I vaguely do. I was
Okay.
in band for 7 years.
Do you know what the Dorian mode is?
No.
Okay. So, yeah, there is a kind of like alternate set of musical scales that we call the Dorian mode. So he's even
I
named.
think I've heard of it, but yeah.
I think most Slayer songs are technically written in the Dorian mode. When I can, I associate everything back to late 1980s thrash metal. So let's try to unpack some of the rest of this preface here, and then I'll give you the reading questions for next time and let you go. Were there particular parts of this that you had trouble with, or just the whole thing?
It was the one sentence. I read it, I don't know how many times. Okay. The highest as the lowest form of criticism is a mode of autobiography.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
I was like, what? The highest as the lowest form
Mm-hmm.
of criticism is a mode.
Okay, so I think a big part of what he's suggesting here throughout this is that responses to art are subjective, right? That I can try to explain this shit to you all day, right? But I can't ensure that you're going to have the same response to it that I do, because everybody's response is on some level personal. So both good critics and bad critics aren't really saying anything about a work of art when they write. They're actually talking about themselves and about their own response to it. So a good critic is going to have a kind of like valuable and interesting and well-reasoned account of their own response to this work of art, while a bad critic is going to basically do the opposite, but it's still going to be personal, right? It's not about the art or about the artist, it's about them. Right? And this is related to the two things that follow, right? Those who find ugly meanings in beautiful things are corrupt without being charming. This is a fault. Those who find beautiful meanings in beautiful things are the cultivated. For these there is hope. Anything else that you guys have questions about in this are going to find? Or like, do you notice any particular kind of system at work here? Any kind of consistent theme?
I feel like he was just trying to say, like, there is no good or bad art. It's all how someone thinks. Like, because I'm marked in the sense I said there's no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. It just like that, like, it's either going to be well written or it's going to be bad. There isn't like a, this is a bad book because of all the stuff in it. It's like, is it written good? Then yes. If it's written bad?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of this is kind of pure aestheticism, right? You know, that art doesn't have a moral value. It's not supposed to teach you a lesson. It exists only to be beautiful, right? You know, the last sentence of this is that all art is quite useless, right? And remember that for Wilde, that's a good thing, right? Art is supposed to be useless. It's not supposed to teach you anything or improve you, right?
It kind of reminds me of like all the people who are like trying to like figure out like the thing with like the Mona Lisa smile, where it's a picture of a woman. Like I have never gotten the whole like Mona Lisa thing.
You know, you should read Walter Pater's chapter on Mona Lisa.
Chapter.
Oh yes, oh yes.
Like they're like her smile, and I look at that and I'm like, she's not smiling. She's just there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think like the sort of people who get it like are the kind of people who like regard like art as being dictated by secret codes or things like you read like what was that shitty novel from the early 2000s? There were lots of them. Right? I think what is it, the Da Vinci Code or something like that,
Oh, the Da Vinci
where they're
Code.
like this Harvard symbologist. There's no such thing as a symbologist, by the way. And there's certainly no symbology department at Harvard. Who goes around finding secret meanings in pictures, right? And is able to deduce from them that there's this this cult
Like the
that-
Illuminati thing.
Yeah, exactly. It has been protecting the secret of the true bloodline of Jesus,
Nice.
since time immemorial. Now, the most interesting response to that I read was actually written by a geneticist who says, look, I'm not saying, I'm not saying whether or not Jesus actually had children, but if he did, virtually everyone on the planet now would be descended from it. So there would be nothing special about that bloodline.
That's like someone trying to say, like, I'm a descendant of Adam and Eve, like, we all are.
Yeah. I mean, there's something like every 8th Irish person is descended from this 8th century king called Niall the Nine Hostage. So, okay, great. So there's nothing special about that particular genetic. Okay, so we heard about it at a time before we just kind of derail completely. So let me give you the guide questions for next time. We're going to spend a little bit more time on the Sybil Vane stuff next time because it's going to become a lot more important. And enjoy the long weekend. Did it go? It did.
So I'm sure you already know this, but
Uh-huh.